Hi gang. To many in the Imperium, the Executioners chapter are a grim reminder of some of its earliest days, a brutal throwback to the horrific wars of the Horus Heresy and the scouring that followed, the Emperor's axemen whose armour is adorned with the severed heads of their enemies. But while the chapter might appear barbaric, in reality it's anything but. If you want more Arbeiterian, have a look at Arbeiterian's Precinct House, the second channel, link down below. The Executioners are an ancient and highly regarded chapter, active since the very earliest days of the Imperium, and very much a product of the Horus Heresy and the wars that followed it. Over 10,000 years of service, they've earned a grim reputation, their armour covered in grisly trophies taken from their enemies, their ways considered barbaric and uncivilized, and their combat doctrine rooted in dauntless endurance and sheer front-on destruction. Other chapters often see them as little more than gore-spattered headhunters from a darker age. But this grim aspect conceals a practical and well-organised core. The Executioners are not some ancient isolationist tribe of barbarians, but a rigidly organised and efficient part of the Imperium's defences, careful to maintain good relations with their neighbours on the southern fringe of the galaxy, and despite their reputation, hailed as reliable and stalwart allies by the fleets and magi that fight alongside them. The Executioners are, perhaps a bit surprisingly, a well-documented third founding successor chapter of the Imperial Fists. The third founding was authorised in the wake of the Scouring, the campaign that forced the broken traitor forces of Horus Lupercal back into the Eye of Terror in the wake of the Horus Heresy, and it occurred shortly after the second founding that broke the Great Space Marine legions into their smaller chapters. The third founding was actually pushed for by Rogal Dorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, who had initially been very reluctant to split his legion up at all, but by this point he'd evidently recanted, and two Imperial Fist successors were created at the time, the Iron Knights and the Executioners. The honour of founding this new chapter was handed to one of Dorn's most trusted lieutenants. Fafnir Ran was the Lord Seneschal of the Imperial Fist Legion's first assault cadre. A native of Dorn's homeworld of Inwit, Ran had originally fought in tribal battles against Dorn's own tribe as a young man, before Inwit was rediscovered by the Imperium and its youth inducted into the Legion wholesale. Ran had fought as part of the 7th Legion for almost 2 centuries by the point of the Horus Heresy, and had risen to become a ruthless and bellicose assault commander, famed for fighting with twinned power axes or with an axe and shield as one of the Imperial Fist's efficient Void-born breacher squads. During the Heresy, he was one of Dorn's most trusted commanders and a valued boarding assault captain. He was assigned to the original Retribution fleet that was sent to combat Horus in the Istvan system before being becalmed in the Warp, and he fought in the resulting Battle of Phal against the attacking Iron Warriors fleet alongside his fellow captain and fleet commander Alexis Pollux. After returning to Terra, he was assigned to the first sphere of defence of the Sol system, alongside First Captain Sigismund, taking part in the Battle of Pluto against the Alpha Legion invading Vanguard, before taking command of the frigate Persephone for the latter parts of the Solar War, and then finally fighting on solid ground through the Siege of Terra, holding the line against vastly superior traitor forces. Ram was then an active commander during the Wars of the Scouring, and came to see himself as the Emperor's executioner, charged with hunting down and executing those traitor elements that still remained in real space, and he continued in this role long after his fellow captains and commanders had been assigned to form their own chapters during the second founding, Pollux to form the Crimson Fists and Sigismund the Black Templars. When the third founding came and he was assigned his own chapter, Ran modelled them in his grim image, a product of the Horus Heresy and the Wars of the Scouring, taking on the title title of High Executioner. His Executioner's chapter were to be the Emperor's headsman. Rather than a defensive role, their self-appointed task would be the seeking out and slaughtering of the Emperor's foes in the deep void, far from the centre of the Imperium. A roving chapter, merciless and uncompromising, though tempered by the discipline of the old Imperial Fist's Legion. Their early assignments were predictably fleet-based, patrolling the fringes of the Imperium, most often around the borders of the segmentums Tempestus and Pacificus to the Imperium's southwest, though in the millennia since, their task forces were seen across the galaxy, chasing some lead to a traitor enclave or following some ancient quest for vengeance. One notable exception was during the War of the Beast in M32, when the new chapter fought alongside the Crimson Fist to defend Terra. This action was conducted as part of the Last Wall protocol that saw the former chapters of the Imperial Fist Legion temporarily reunite and ended in the refounding of the Imperial Fist chapter. Apart from occasional blips like that, their fleet-based deployment continued for millennia until the end of the Age of Apostasy. The Executioners had taken part in the conflict as one of the forces that opposed the apostate Cardinal Bucaris and his pocket empire that was centred around Gathalamor in the Segmentum Solar, and known as the Plague of Unbelief. The chapter fought alongside the Raven Guard, the Angels of Absolution, and the nearby Space Wolves chapters. In fact, the Space Wolves, with whom the Executioners got on greatly, gave them the name Clatur Socken, the Laughing Axemen, an ironic reference to the Executioners' grim and humorless aspect. Most famously, they enacted the decapitation of the world of Nova Sulis, a hive world whose rulers were funding the Cardinal's siege of the Fenris system. The Executioners descended to the planet in a swarm of assault rams and orbital insertion craft, aimed squarely at the Manufactoria districts and the lush countryside estates of the ruling caste, and the warriors of the chapter systematically slaughtered anyone who dared to take up arms against them, only sparing those who knelt in their presence. When they finally left the planet, the ruling class were literally beheaded, their skulls lining the streets of their hives as a warning, and the production capacity of the planet left burning in their wake. At the close of the Age of Apostasy, in recognition of their service, a new chapter, the Iron Champions, were raised from their gene seed, the first of at least 3 descendants, and then later in M37, the chapter finally took up residence on a permanent base, the Darkenhold, an asteroid station gravitationally trapped between the twin planets of Stygia Aquilon, worlds of fire and ice that orbited a dying star on the edge of the southern galactic fringe. Since then, the Darkenvault has become a colossal deep void starport, its forbidding depths home to the Executioner's fleet of skull-proud warships, but despite being on the far fringes of the galaxy, the Executioners have taken care not to become too isolated from the rest of the Imperium. The Darkenvault's cavernous depths are part of a string of supply stations that extend from the Segmentum Tempestus fleet base at Bacca, and the Executioners have even been known to allow refuge in extremis for Imperial ships or explorator missions launched into the void between galaxies. This positioning has led to a curious dichotomy within the chapter. The warriors of the Executioners are often seen as brutal and somewhat barbaric by other chapters, and their chapter cult and beliefs are unique to say the least. Recruited from a swathe of feral worlds across the region, the warriors of the Executioners value martial ability and skill at arms, but shorn of the fanciful knightly trappings that other chapters might chase. Instead, the goal of an Executioner is simply the remembrance of their deeds in the chapter's massively oversized reclusiam within the halls of the Darkenvault. Most notably, the warriors of the Executioners are headhunters, fond of taking the decapitated heads of their enemies as trophies, not just for the symbology of it. Though most of these heads are discarded after the battle, the heads of particularly worthy enemies might adorn a Battle Brothers armor, but they're also taken for the purpose of tallying the Battle Brothers' deeds after the battle. These tallies are kept by the Death Speakers, the chapter's chaplains, who keep the records of the chapter's battles and recite the deeds of the Honor Brothers during holy feasts within the Darkenvault. symbol. The Death Speakers, their faces tattooed with the skull of their order, have a massively important role in the chapter, and their reclusiarch holds the dual rank of Lord Speaker of the Dead, the most senior reciter of the chapter's deeds, and High Mortiurge, the judge and assigner of penitence. The Lord Speaker frequently leads the chapter on combined deployments, second only in rank to the chapter master themselves. As you might expect, culturally, the chapter is highly independent and quite insular, its members famed for their bleak and grim outlook on life. An executioner marine will not hesitate to avenge any stain on their honour with blood, though since all their duels are to either maiming or death, there's little in the way of brawling within the chapter. These beliefs can breed a particular sort of stubbornness though. The chapter are unafraid of battles of attrition and have even been known to give in to their bloodlust, to keep fighting on where better judgment might have seen them quit the field, a trait that might have been inherited from their legion primogenitors. And these beliefs can give the battle brothers of the chapter a fearsome appearance. Their battle plate is a gunmetal grey, often with yellow and gold detailing, with veterans preferring gold shoulder pads and sometimes helmets, and squad and battlefield role markings are commonly displayed on the knee pads. Their armour is commonly etched with the names of its wearer and its previous wearers, another way of recording the deeds of battle brothers down the ages. Their chapter symbol is the twin axes that were the personal heraldry of Fafnir Ran, but their armour is also decorated with more grisly trophies, tribal fetishes, the skulls and also flayed skin of their slain enemies, and various symbols of death all add to their barbaric appearance. But despite all of this, in actual tactical organisation, the chapter is relatively orthodox. The executioners cleave closely to the tenets of the Codex Astartes, with only a few minor changes in organisation based on their extreme preference for close quarters combat. The executioners prefer to engage their foes in melee, all the better for the tally of trophies, and this has affected their company organisation to some degree. Since their founding by Ran, the chapter master of the executioners has been known as the High Executioner, and although he's in ultimate control of the chapter, each of the chapter's companies has a very high level of independence, their captains holding the title of Warlord, able to commit their forces as they wish. The chapter also maintains a ruling council of senior officers, able to countermand the orders of the High Executioner should he prove unfit, and any of the company captains may challenge for the title, with those challenges settled in bouts of bloody personal combat. Companies are then organised according to the Codex standard, with a few exceptions. The chapter's rites and rituals are ensured by the 3 Death Speaker chaplains assigned to every company, and a common practice within the chapter is the dropping of a Devastator or Fire Support Squad from the company lists in exchange for a squad of Stern Guard-equipped veterans to improve the company's close-range firepower. The executioners tend to disdain lighter armed units like bikers. Any recon is conducted either in force with heavy armour or by land speeders, and they maintain a very large number of orbital insertion craft from their days as a fleet-based chapter, all the better for closing with the enemy as quickly as possible. That preference for heavy armour is then helped by their very well-maintained ties to other Imperial worlds in the sector. They maintain ancient pacts with the Mechanicus of the Forge world of Griffon, and they have the use of Battlefleet Tempestus's fleet anchorages and supply stations across the whole region, all of which has helped maintain their own fleet and stockpile of armaments and allowed them to keep functioning as a relatively Codex chapter all those millennia. In the years up to the present time of 40k, the Executioners chapter has participated in a number of landmark engagements. In M39, they suffered a series of setbacks when the Darken Vault was one of many outposts on the southern fringe to be assailed by Xenos raiders. Orc Wars from outside the bounds of the Astronomicon assailed the southern Imperium, and the twin worlds of Stygia Aquilon came under desperate assault from an unknown xenoform that the Imperium had no records of ever encountering. Possibly, in retrospect, this was the Sloth. The Executioners fought alone in the void against the invasion until the Xenos were finally able to penetrate the Darken Vault itself, and were only saved by a relief fleet sent by the Astral Claws chapter and supported by Battlefleet Tempestus. Only 300 Executioners remained in the aftermath of the siege, and the chapter was under strength for centuries after. In 137 M40, the chapter engaged in the pursuit of the renegade rogue trader Hector Revocan, who had turned his guns on many of the worlds of the southern segmentum tempestus as a sacrifice to the dark gods. After a 5-decade reign of terror, he was finally cornered in the Mir system by a combined Executioners and Mechanicus fleet, and the chapter's assault rams managed to penetrate the rogue trader's flagship, the Night Hag, shortly before it translated to warp space. The Executioners trapped aboard fought through the flagship compartment by compartment with insane zeal, forcing their way through squads of Revocan's allied World Eater Traitor Space Marines, and eventually slaying the rogue trader and claiming the ancient Night Hag as their prize. With the assistance of the Mechanicus of Griffon, the ship was cleansed of corruption and rededicated to the service of the chapter. And then in late M41, the chapter were the subject of another unknown Xenos attack on the dead world of Carrion Deep in the Veiled region. In 899, the second company of the chapter came under attack first by a legion of floating metallic spheres, and then by metallic humanoids operating under a cloaked leader. After a terrible ambush, the Executioner's High Chaplain, the Lord Speaker of the Dead, Thulsa Kane, eventually managed to force a breakthrough by defeating the Metallic Lord in single combat. After enduring serious injury to himself, he finally led a third of the company to safety from an attack that, in hindsight, became one of the Imperium's first recorded encounters with the Necron. And shortly after that would come Badab. Unlike many of the other chapters involved in the Badab War, the Executioners were neither a member of the Maelstrom Warders or responding to a request by the Inquisition. Instead, their involvement came after the receipt of a call for aid directly from the Astral Claws chapter, and their own belief that, whatever the issue, they were honour-bound to honour that debt from 2 millennia before, when the Astral Claws had relieved the siege of the Darken Vault. The Executioners therefore entered the war on the side of Lufthuron's secessionists, responding in 2 waves that would eventually see the deployment of almost the entire chapter. The first wave to arrive entered the Maelstrom Zone in 904 M41 and comprised the 3rd Company, commanded by the warlord Vanir Hex, aboard the Night Hag, which, as a former rogue trader vessel, had considerably more extended long-range capability than the rest of the fleet. This force engaged in harrying attacks on the early Loyalist deployments until around 907, when the rest of the chapter forced their way into the war. Just over 7 companies ultimately deployed aboard 1 battle barge, 5 cruisers and 10 frigates, all under the overall control of High Chaplain Thulsa Kane. The Executioners were initially welcomed by the secessionists with open arms, and they were a devastating blow to the Loyalist advance. Their initial push into the zone saw them decimate Howling Griffin's forces at Chimera, eventually relegating that chapter to garrison duty for the rest of the campaign, and they fought a brutal and bloody path through the rest of the war. The Night Hag, in particular, became the terror of Loyalist cruisers, able to outmatch far larger ships one-on-one and swift enough to escape protracted battles. They became the most mobile raiding force possessed by the secessionists, destroying Loyalist outposts and forcing the Loyalists to constrain their actions lest they lose their supply lines. However, all of this was very much on the Executioners' own terms, and they increasingly kept the Astral Claws and the other secessionists at arm's length. They refused to serve as garrison troops in any way, and frequently prosecuted their attacks against other Astartes only as far as achieving the objective at hand. Their tendency to avoid unnecessary casualties and leave survivors, allowing their enemies to retreat with honour, gradually infuriated the tyrant of Badab. By 909, he was deploying his Astral Claws forces to shadow his allies, hoping that they could mop up after the Executioners had left and started to distance the Executioners from his wider battle plans. Though the Executioners continued to fight for the secessionist cause, repaying their debt of honour to the last, they were to eventually turn on the Astral Claws after the disastrous attack on the Salamander's battle barge Pyre of Glory, in which their allied Astral Claws forces boarding the vessel were caught by the executioners attempting to steal the salamander's gene seed, something the executioners considered far beyond the bounds of honourable combat. After this, and maybe realising the predicament they were in, the executioners became a rogue element for the rest of the war, defending themselves against both sides while conducting their own private war to weaken the Astral Claws. They'd fight a brutal battle against recently arrived Carcharodon's forces during the Corcorium massacre in 910 M41, before eventually negotiating an exit from the war in 911 with the help of the Salamanders. The Salamanders' cruiser Obsidia interrupting the chapter's purge of the Sons of Medusa's forces and escorting High Chaplain Kane and his honour guard to Crow's World to await trial. The executioners emerged from the fires of the Badab War with relatively few losses. In punishment for their initial siding with the secessionists, they were banned from their homeworld and sent on a 100-year penitent crusade, during which they were prohibited from raising new recruits, the Darken Vault given over to the Salamanders to hold in trust until its completion. Over the next century, that penitent crusade earned them numerous battle honours across the length and breadth of the Imperium. In 919 M41, the chapter began a campaign of destruction against recidivist cults in the Telemon Cloud and the Garia Rifts, both far from the gaze of the High Lords, and then in 965 M41, they fought against the ancient and unencountered human worlds of Methusa, near the galactic core. Founded by a lost family of rogue traders in the distant past, the executioners considered Methusa secessionists from the Imperium, and given their recent past, fell upon the system with characteristic zeal. In fact, the stain on their honour that was Badab influenced many of their missions while they were on crusade. The executioners considered the hunting down of the renegade Astral Claws, particularly ones who served during the boarding of the Pyre of Glory, to be of the greatest priority. Near the end of that crusade, the chapter would then become involved in the final throes of the Orphean War, arriving near its conclusion to find a near-dead system ravaged by the corrupted Necrons of the Maynarch dynasty. The chapter fell upon the remnants of the Necron war host with a fury, declaring this to be the end of their death quest, and when the survivors finally returned to the Darken Vault, they were met by a torchbearer fleet, sent by Guilliman and carrying Call's gift. Finally able to recruit once again, new aspirants to the ranks of the executioners are now created as Primaris Space Marines, and many of the older Battle Brothers, veterans of Badab and the wars before, have crossed the Rubicon Primaris, seeing it as a new beginning for their chapter. But old grudges die hard, and the chapter are still known to continue the hunt for renegades from the old war, intent on wiping clean the stain on their honour, one Astral Claw at a time. Outside the lore, the executioners have a surprisingly simple history for one of these Badab chapters. Just like all the others, they were introduced in the original Badab War article, illustrated here by Gary Chalk in a camo grey and black scheme and with a much simpler axe logo. And then, like many of these chapters, they were kind of forgotten about on the fringes of 40k for 20 or so years. It's really after the 2010 Badab War books by Alan Bligh that they start to pop up a bit more. These books give us the Emperor's headsman background and a bit of their culture, which was then expanded through a number of short stories over the following years, like 2013's Death Speakers by Andy Smiley. They also very briefly pop up in the War of the Beast books. That original Badab article mentioned Fafnir Ran, but in reality his background and like the reasoning for why the executioners are like the way they are was a much later invention. First hinted at in the third Horus Heresy Black Book, and then expanded through the later Horus Heresy novels and Siege of Terror books. Ran isn't really a character in the early novels, to be honest. The only Imperial Fist character you see at the start is Dawn himself, but as the action moves closer to Terror, Fafnir Ran then becomes one of the main characters by the end of the series. And then finally that jump into the Primaris era is detailed in a short story from 2024, Tally of Slaughter. So the executioners have become one of those chapters that don't actually have a huge presence in 40k lore. They sort of pop up here and there in short stories or in sidebars without ever being the main characters, but for some reason they feel much more well known than a lot of similarly sparse chapters, certainly than a lot of other Badab chapters. And that's probably a combination of the Imperial Fists just having relatively few detailed successors for a very long time, and also Fafnir Ran becoming such a main character in the recent Heresy stories. Either way, with them now officially updated to the 41st or 42nd millennium, whichever one we're in, it looks like they'll continue popping up on the southern fringes of the 40k world for a little while longer. Thanks for watching. Hey, you want some merch? There's a store link below. Get a Stupid Frog t-shirt. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, why don't like and subscribe, or of course pop over to Arbeiterian's Precinct House for the latest book club and Tale of Four Gamers videos. See ya!